and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
Welcome back to Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs with me, Jamie Franklin, and I'm joined today on this very special episode by Daniel French. Daniel, how are you doing today?
Well, better. I had the dreaded lurgy about 3 weeks ago, so...
and you are still alive.
Still alive, yes.
Still here.
It's hilarious, actually, when you're a vicar, particularly in a small town, everyone knows your business. So
yes.
You can be walking along the most remote beach and someone says, "Oh, vicar, I gather you had COVID or have COVID," blah, 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 blah. And most of that's benign.
Yeah.
One or two sort of moments where it was clear that there was some gossip that was not so healthy, I had one parishioner who said, "Oh, we'd heard that you were in hospital." And one or two again, I was picking up on he is a lockdown skeptic.
Oh dear.
Join the dots kind of thing.
Yeah.
But on the whole, everybody's been really kind. My wife got it too, and we've got the lady who lodges with us who also had it. I'd say it was 3-4 days of flu-y feeling.
Yeah.
And then subsequently a sort of a dry coffee chesty, thing. So I think I'm largely over it now. So
yeah. Well, you're looking quite grizzled, and you're like an ecclesiastical version of Hugh Jackman in the X-Men films.
Yeah, I don't think I'm quite there yet.
So speaking of hospital, you weren't in hospital, were you? But
I was not in hospital.
But Pope Francis says that, and I don't quote him very often, but he says that the church is a hospital for souls. So there is a sense in which perhaps you have been in hospital, but a spiritual hospital. Anyway, that's a tenuous link. Daniel, we had an amazing experience last night, and I assume that many people will be watching us for the first time because they will be tuning in to see our interview with Lord Frost. And I have to say, you've just said it to me off air rather, that I am buzzing after that. It's the following morning, and you said it to me, and it was the same. It was hard to sleep last night, wasn't it? Because it was so exciting.
It's just amazing.
Yeah.
Wonderful, quiet, gentle man who, in his exposition of his life, his work, and the last year or two, just quietly said it, nailed it.
Devastating. And we're going to play that interview out in a minute, so don't switch off, because it's literally about to happen for you, listeners and viewers. We're going to show the whole thing. We're not going to hold back. It's coming to you in a moment, and we'll do
moments in this that are really
absolutely.
I've had to sort of in my head rewind and play back over and over again, really. Just
I mean, I felt that it was like almost everything he said it just hit, as you said, I can't really think of any other way to say it. It just hit the mark. It was like perfectly pitched, articulated, devastating, penetrating comment about whatever it was that we asked him about. And it was, and the other thing I really appreciated is just his sort of humility and modesty and honesty. So refreshing when we've had 2 years of just obfuscating, patronizing crap, if I'm honest with you. He puts the average politician to shame, really. I know there are lots of great politicians out there, and I don't want to do them all down. I was listening to an interview with Charles Walker this morning, and I thought he was seriously impressive as well. So I don't want to say it about all politicians, but the average kind of stuff you get from, say, the cabinet, when you compare somebody like Lord Frost, it's like talking to a human being as opposed to talking to some kind of helicopter parent robot politician. So I'm super excited to play this interview.
About the engagement, and but for those who have labelled us as conspiracy nuts, was it postmodern conspiracy nut freak show?
That was my mum.
Was it really? Sorry, Mum.
No, she said worse. No, it wasn't really.
Oh,
Sorry, it wasn't really. I don't want to slander my mum. Yeah, no, exactly, Daniel. But honestly, I don't want to sort of be negative about it by comparing him to others negatively. But I was just blown away, and we're about to play it. And I think what we should do is we'll just say, like we always, so basically what we'll do is we'll play the interview, then you and I are going to talk about it a little bit, just a bit of reflection. And then we'll do what we normally do in the episode, which normally comes at the start, which was we do a short reflection on scripture, try and apply it to life and society. And then we're going to talk about the news more broadly. So we've got some good stuff coming up on, particularly, we might touch on the COVID restriction lifting, but we're not really that fussed about talking about that for ages. We're going to talk about bishops in the Church of England. And specifically, Daniel, you've got some comments to make about Archbishop of Canterbury's comments on vaccination in General Synod. We might talk a bit about free speech because that's very important as well. But we also might run out of time. So let's see how it goes.
Hello, a sort of shout out to friends in General Synod, particularly in the Exeter Diocese. You know, if you come to your tea break today, when this is going out, and you need a little sort of intellectual, spiritual refreshment, we have it here in dollopfuls.
Well, we hope so, and massive shout out to everyone in General Synod who are friends. But I don't really have any friends in General Synod, so just from Daniel. But I send good wishes as well. All right, should we say Lord's Prayer? And then we'll play the Lord Frost interview, which is an hour long. So sit back, relax, and enjoy it after we've said a brief prayer. So let us pray. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Okay, well, here's the moment you've been waiting for, our interview with Lord Frost. Well, we're delighted to welcome to the show Lord Frost. David Frost, thank you so much for coming on to Irreverent and joining us for this discussion.
It's great to be here. Fantastic to be here, and looking forward to our discussion. You, the three of you, and this podcast has been so important to me over the last year, as you've kind of talked about things that others really have not, and talked about things in a way that others haven't. So it's just great to be on. So thank you.
Well, and I can hardly believe I'm hearing you say that. That's
it's extraordinary, really, isn't it? Given that we're sort of, well, no longer two curates and a rascally voice, but as you were dismissively named, weren't you, Daniel, by his Eminence Welby, but a sort of a group of rather uninfluential clergymen who, I guess, we just tried to do what we could when we saw an injustice, but the rest of the church seemed to remain rather silent, on with notable exceptions. But I'm not quite certain how we've got here, in a sense.
I think it's fascinating in that yesterday the Times leaked this document from the Church of England about its restructuring. There's constant need to get the perfect top-down solution, and this kind of maybe shows what three vicars can do with an iPhone.
So before we talk about ourselves too much, I'm sure, Lord Frost, the absolute vast majority of our listeners will know who you are already. But for those who don't, or perhaps aren't fully aware of who you are and what you've been up to, can you give us some idea of who you are, and in particular what your role has been in government over the last couple of years, and perhaps more broadly?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I spent most of my professional life as a diplomat, so I've been posted mainly in the nicer end of places one can go, and I finished up as ambassador in Denmark, and that was all great. I left the civil service about 10 years ago as I got kind of frustrated with the way it worked, and in particular frustrated with the direction of travel on Europe. And I went off to run a big trade association, Scotch Whisky Association, for 3 years, and then more by luck than judgment, I was put in touch with Boris, with the PM as he now is, and I went to work for him first as when he was Foreign Secretary, stuck with him when he left, and came back in when he became Prime Minister. And since then, over the last 2.5 years, I've been the EU advisor. I picked up the EU negotiations in the slightly messy state they've been left by Theresa May and our predecessors, and got us out of the EU. People may agree or disagree with that, but anyway, we did it. And since then, been dealing with some of the loose ends as a minister until I left last month. The proximate cause of which was the decision to bring in the Plan B restrictions that I'd said I wouldn't live with, and I didn't, and that's why I'm here now.
Yeah. So in many ways, you've really been at the very heart of government, deeply involved in these central issues, like, as you've just said, Brexit and COVID. So you've been at the heart of government at pivotal moments, what will turn out to be significant aspects of British history.
Yeah, I think so. I think the last 2.5 years certainly have been a period like no other. The first 6 months or so after Boris became Prime Minister, nobody knew what was going to happen, almost literally day to day, whether the government was going to survive or not, and how. But I think we did our historic duty, which was to deliver on the referendum results that people have voted, and whether you agreed or disagreed, we thought the right thing was to make it happen. So that's what we did, and it has been an extraordinary experience, and I think showed up the kind of strengths of the way British government works, and many of the weaknesses. And of course, we haven't been so reflective about it as we might have been, because we're overwhelmed by the pandemic almost immediately afterwards, and that's where everything's been since then.
Yeah,
it's quite.
Go on, Tom. You go.
It's quite noteworthy, actually, just sort of thinking back, and I think you're right in the leaving the EU was something that I was quite passionate about for quite a long time, ever since I was a student, actually. Mostly, and we might talk a bit more about this later, to do with what I feel like incompatibility of the common law and civil law systems. And I think that's an incompatibility that the pandemic has shown, actually. I remember Matt Hancock, we've said it before, but telling, I believe he told Cabinet, we're going to have to be adopting a sort of a civil law system through this period, which already got my sort of hackles up, actually, because I think common law has protected the freedoms of the citizenry subjects of Her Majesty the Queen for many centuries. But the point you make about the pandemic wiping out quite how much of an achievement that is, or diminishing it is quite sad. And it's also quite worth reflecting that back when Boris was first Prime Minister, and we had all that trouble with an unruly Parliament, and we cursed the parliamentary powers in a sense. Why aren't the executive a bit stronger? And then we got to the pandemic, and suddenly it's the balance swung dramatically, maybe the other way. The executive was discovered to be overpowerful, and Parliament, without the sufficient sort of artillery to counter it. And there's something there. Maybe have we lost a sense of the balance of our constitution? Is the question I guess I want to ask you.
I mean, it's a big question. I think what went wrong in 2019 was it was almost a kind of Cromwell-style takeover. That Parliament decided to have a go at running the country, or at least EU policy itself, without being accountable to anybody, and our system just can't work like that. And I think it did. That's why it just didn't last for very long. I think our system is basically an adversarial one. It depends on organized political parties. It depends on manifestos and being committed to them and delivering them. And I think the problem in the pandemic was we didn't have any organized opposition, so nothing was tested. The government found it very easy to get through all kinds of controversial stuff, and it was only sort of growing unease, I guess, around people like Steve Baker and others that eventually it was impossible to stop the debate entirely. And again, eventually in our system it came out.
Yeah. So lots of people, certainly lots of people who listen to this show, I think there's been a sense of, which I share myself, a sense of shock really over what's happened over the last couple of years. People who voted Conservative, lots of people who'd be in the pews in Church of England churches could never have imagined they'd have a situation where the government would be telling them, who they could and could not see, and the various other unimaginable things that have happened over the past couple of years. So that's been shocking in itself. But then there's also been this sense that the government and politicians in general have been moving towards this sort of homogenous kind of globalist agenda, which takes in things like, of course, the COP26 net zero agenda, the woke agenda and identitarian politics, and indeed a more authoritarian approach to government in general, which Tom says is far more Napoleonic in tone than British. So lots of people are looking at this thinking, how on earth have we got to this stage? And, as you say, although things with COVID appear to be ramping down, there are still other things which appear to be authoritarian and quite worrying, like I would cite the online safety bill, which I think is quite worrying in some ways. So could you, Lord Frost, help us to understand, from your perspective of being an insider to all this, what exactly is going on in politics to cause this drift?
Yeah, I think it's it's a really good question, and it goes to the heart of kind of where things are at the moment. I think there's no doubt that there is a very strong kind of globalist current, if you like, in the world that is around COP26 and all sorts of other things, and the kind of assumption that the right solutions to everything are international, their international treaties, their leaders getting together and so on. And I don't think you need resort to any kind of conspiracies about this. I think it's just leaders spend all the time talking to each other, and certainly for Western leaders, if you want to be thought of as a kind of decent, right-thinking person, you tend not to get too far away from what all your peers think. So that's why the path of least resistance is to go along with climate policies, for example, or to fall in line with the sort of received international thinking on things. And I think that's why national democracy is so important, because it's the pushback. And I think one of the frustrations we had in the EU was that national democracy didn't matter. Whatever we decided at elections, could if that wasn't EU policy, if it wasn't EU law, there wasn't anything you could do about it. It's sort of less extreme internationally and globally, but it's still there. So national democracy is really important as a way of keeping people in touch with what the man or woman in the street thinks about things and how they see the world. That's what we achieved, I think, after Brexit, but it's just the beginning.
Would you say that the pandemic has highlighted something within the EU system, that now we're out of the EU, we see a collection of nations who seem to kind of particularly relish the sort of powers, mandates, centralization. That's it seems to highlight something which really goes against the sort of British way of thinking. Though we've obviously had lockdowns, but I just get this feeling they're going to be in for it a lot longer than we are.
Yeah, certainly what you see across continental Europe is really quite worrying. And, they've gone a long way further in vaccine mandates and lockdowns than we have. And there seems to be generally, a lot less political pushback against it. There's more people on the streets, arguably, in some places than there have been here. But that's probably a function of the fact that the political classes aren't kind of voicing any of this, so people don't have any alternative. The whole EU system was really designed to stop inconvenient popular opinion from disrupting what governments wanted to do too much. That's overt. It's not a it's not a conspiracy. That's what Monet and others wanted to do, to build the organization. But the problem is, the more it's got integrated and the more powers it's taken on, the closer it gets to the core of national life and what's really important to people, and you start getting this reaction. I think the vaccine thing in the EU is a really good example of where, all the EU leaders just thought, obviously, we'll be able to do this better at EU level than at national level. They didn't really test it. They allowed von der Leyen and her team to get on with it, and it proved a bit of a mess. And meanwhile, we got on with it and got ahead of the game. And I just think that's so important. And actually, the EU itself would probably have come to better decisions if it had a few more other Europeans saying, "Hang on a minute, we're not so sure about this."
Can I ask a question specifically about the beginning of the lockdown and how this all happens? I mean, Tom, just before we were recording, was saying, what's the thing about Toby Young's theory about Boris, Tom?
So, Toby Young, of course, I believe he knows Boris through school or something, doesn't he? They were pals, yeah. And he maintains, and it's a sort of it's the big debate on the Delling pod, isn't it? Is Boris Johnson sort of essentially trapped? Is he a libertarian, liberal prime minister who doesn't like what's happened, what he's been forced to do by realpolitik, and is itching to let us out, or is there more buy-in from him? And I suspect the answer is not quite simple and binary like that, because these things never are. And obviously, there's a sort of collegiate nature of government, and there are other ministers, Michael Gove, Matt Hancock, who are obviously at different places entirely. But although Michael Gove has recently apologised, I believe, so hopefully he's moving away from it, which is. But is the Toby Young thesis is it correct? Is that where we are?
So I don't think a prime minister can ever be kind of captured by the system. The prime minister always has the power to decide what they want and ask for whatever information they want and come to their own conclusions. So, if there are failures, I think that's part of the reason why. I think I wasn't in every meeting in the very early days of the lockdown, because we were trying to get going with the talks with the EU, but what I do think people, I do think Boris was resisting it, but there simply wasn't enough hard information. Nobody knew for sure in March quite how dangerous it was. Nobody really knew how fast it was spreading, and so I don't find it that surprising that at that moment everyone erred on the side of caution. It's more what came after, and for 12 months repeated refusal to interrogate the models, to look at the evidence, to think about hang on, is it as bad as we said? Are some of the things we thought about it at the start, are they still true? And to kind of adjust the position. And that's what I found most frustrating, as far as I could tell, and then that's why I got so sort of depressed when we seemed to be going round the cycle again at the end of last year, and luckily we managed to stop ourselves somehow.
I don't think it's just luck, isn't it? I mean, the hundreds in Parliament, and indeed arguably your own resignation, I think were not luck. They were organised resistance at the highest level. But so I think you can take some credit for our freedom, actually, Lord Frost. I say that seriously, but
can I just ask just one sort of extra question here? I hear what you're saying about the beginning of the pandemic, and I remember I listened to your Planet Normal podcast, and you were talking about the way Boris was sort of looking for other information, and it sort of wasn't there right at the beginning. The thing, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I accept it, but I remember very early on reading an article by Simon Jenkins in The Guardian, of all places, talking about the way that Neil Ferguson's track record was absolutely appalling in predicting outcomes from pandemics. And that was, I mean, it was very early on, in the first couple of weeks of the lockdown, I think, and that raised significant questions in my mind. And that sort of information, particularly, I think about, mathematical models and thermos in particular, that was all available. So it does still seem a little bit odd that Boris didn't have, somebody in his ear saying, why didn't you get a second opinion or something like that? What's your view on that?
So I think, there were people saying that, and it's hard to remember now just how weird it seems, and it seemed at the time. And I we've all got used to it now, but at the time I was just incredulous, and we looked at the Italians and the French and others doing it and thought, this can't possibly happen here, and yet it did. I think what was happening across Europe was part of it, that it would have taken a huge amount of political courage. Very high risk reward if you got it right, like the Swedes did. But if we got it wrong, it would have been disastrous. So I think there was risk aversion, and I don't really blame him. I think it was how quickly we came out of it all was is in my view the real problem here. Yeah, we just sort of got stuck.
We did, didn't we? Because it was sort of the mess. I remember sort of three or 4 weeks in, thinking the goalposts have shifted, haven't they? Because obviously Boris was still ill, recuperating, and his ministers didn't feel able to bring us out on their own. And yet we had a clear peak before the lockdown had come in, and the NHS was demonstrably within capacity even at that peak. And so at that point, one would have maybe hoped that the leadership could have been there to take us out really quite quickly, and we wouldn't all be complaining about this 2 years later. But it wasn't. Boris was ill. Who knows if he hadn't caught it? Who knows what, or had a mild dose? Who knows where we'd be now? It's one of those odd tips.
It might have made some difference. I think. I'm not sure. I think, once governments have taken big decisions like that, the tendency is to kind of look for evidence as to why it was the right thing to do, rather than admit that you got it wrong. And even 2 years later, we can see that even now, virtually every country in the world's tried a lockdown, and yet, to me, there is still no conclusive, persuasive evidence that lockdowns really prevent the flow of the virus or do more harm than good. And surely you'd be able to expect to see that now after 2 years if there was evidence. And yet the establishment still finds it really hard to admit, globally, not just here. And this refusal to kind of interrogate what you did and look at evidence. It's quite a common government thing, I think. It's just that this was such a massive thing, and it brought it home to everyone that this was a big problem in the way government worked. Yeah, and we're sort of stuck with it a little even now, I think.
Yeah, it's the so-called sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
So you'd say that because there's been a lot of speculation about that. So you'd say that actually has quite a lot of explanatory power once the initial decision has been made.
I would say so. I think it's just reluctance to admit that we got things wrong, and if it is at each occasion, the second and third lockdowns, it's just seemed like the safest thing to do, and nobody's wanted to go out on a limb against it, and that's sad.
Yeah,
I thought it was interesting, particularly in the first lockdown, to see how many civic institutions and grand bodies, from say the police, teachers' unions, healthcare workers, schools, what have you, seem to go completely overboard on this. And I always used to wonder, why aren't they being reined in? Police officers with drones on moorlands.
That was near me, Jay.
In the middle of nowhere.
It was in Derbyshire.
Absolutely nowhere. Or, police going around beaches.
Yeah, enforcing guidance is
out. Or school unions. Being so careful, so over the top in terms of taking the supposedly safest option. I found that kind of, it sort of betrayed something that it kind of revealed something that since the sort of Blair revolution, we'd lost part of our nerve as a society, particularly with the police. I found that very, very interesting, that here was an organization 2-3 years ago was, whether it's right or not, moaning that they, it's creed occur for wanting more resources to handle crime, and yet suddenly found that all the energy to arrest granny having a birthday party. Presumably those county lines hadn't disappeared during lockdown. Criminals hadn't
quite the opposite
stopped doing crime, but yet the energy seemed to suddenly go to this sort of authoritarian mode. And I found that bizarre, that in this country we didn't sort of pull back on that and say, come on, light touch, chaps.
I found, I think you, Daniel, wrote an article in Mallard last year where you said it had been unnerving, and I thought, when I read that was exactly what I thought. It captured it, and there was something deeply weird about the whole experience, and I was trying to sort of work out what it was that was so weird. And I think there are two aspects to it, but one of them is definitely what you mentioned, the way that everybody sort of suddenly swung behind the messaging. All of civil society, including the church, obviously to a large extent, but as you say, everyone just sort of, they seem to see their role as being an echo chamber for the government and oversimplifying everything. It feeling kind of disloyal to question any of this, and the whole thing about kind of banging pans on your doorstep and so on. I mean, it just felt quite totalitarianism, and in some ways,
duct tape on the children's benches.
Yeah.
And it was worse because it was sort of, for in inverted commas, good cause. I mean, normally totalitarianism is for bad things, and everybody knows they're kind of bad. But it made it worse that it was, we're all in this together, and it was for our own safety. Somehow made it even harder to kind of challenge, and that's one of the things that felt so weird.
Very contrary to the meme that was popular for the last decade of keep calm, carry on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which I noticed sort of disappeared as years.
Panic and stay at home.
Yeah, panic and stay at home. Panic and change everything. But this is, I mean, this is something that's worth talking about, really, isn't it? Because the way that the public swung behind it, well, it wasn't just chance, was it? It was actually part. There's a government agency whose job is to nudge and to develop sort of psychological techniques to help control us, really, isn't it? I mean, there's no other way of putting it. That's what they do. I mean, whether whether that's a benign thing like lose a few pounds, or whether arguably not such a benign thing as become terrified of a virus and react as in a completely over the top way. It's there, and it's been exposed a bit now, hasn't it? But have you did you come across them at all?
I mean, I didn't directly. I think. The kind of nudge way of looking at the world is fairly deeply embedded now. The unit had existed for 20 years or more. 10 years when this
Cameron, wasn't it? Yeah.
This started, and we'd already had like kind of minor key ways of using it. Don't put chocolates at tills in supermarkets, kind of thing, and so on. So I think it was sort of quite. It was already embedded in the way people thought about things, so some of it just happened naturally. Again, I don't think there was a kind of secret plot to kind of sort of turn the British population into robots. I think they probably just used a lot of the things that were there. The government was sort of scared that people wouldn't obey, so they over-egged it a bit, and then couldn't pull back, and it's obviously gone in really deeply. And I remember having conversations with people about the that particular case, the drones in Derbyshire, and all the kind of over aggressive policing that we saw, and saying, why are we doing this? Surely, we don't need to do this. And people saying, well, no, we do, because the law is in place and we must stand by the police to enforce it. So it just was deeply strange. The whole thing was just strange.
Laura Dodsworth says in her book that she thinks the use of behavioural psychology is actually undermining of the entire democratic process because it affects people on a subconscious level. And therefore, it's arguably unethical, but it's certainly the case that we should be having some kind of national debate about it. Do you agree with her analysis?
I do. I wouldn't go as far as she does in her book. I think it's a bit overrated, but I do. I've never liked this sort of behavioural psychology way of looking at things. I think governments should, politicians' job is to kind of have ideas and persuade people of them, not to kind of try and trick people into doing things that they think are in their interest. Because who says they're in their interest? You're making your value judgment at the centre. You're imposing it on others, and I don't think you should do that without actual debate about things. It should be out in the open.
It's sort of reversal of I'm reminded of the collect from the Book of Common Prayer, the prayer for Her Queen's Majesty, where you in the communion service where you there's this wonderful clause, duly considering whose authority she hath, where the people pray for her, and it's interesting that even a sort of even in a sort of time of when it's written of quite absolute power of the monarchs, there's acknowledgement of where the authority is coming from is actually the people whose legitimate authority is invested in the Queen, and now is invested through the Queen into government. And so, actually, what this sort of nudge unit thing does is it inverts that authority, doesn't it? It turns them from our servants to being our government, because government are fundamentally the servants of the people, to being our masters, where they can decide.
I think so, and I just don't think. I mean, it's partly a product of governments trying to do too much and too many things, and kind of feeling they're responsible for sort of safety and well-being all the time, and therefore they have to take the measures that they feel they need to make this happen. And I just think it's gone a bit. Probably has gone a bit far. We need a bit more debate about this. I don't think it was the only thing that underlay the problems with lockdown, though. I think there was a lot more to it in the different strands that produced the problems that we got.
A related issue is the relationship of the corporate media and the government. I can't remember what the exact figure is, but I think there's been over £1 billion spent on advertising by the government over the last couple of years with the UK media. I might be getting that figure wrong, but it's an awful lot of money. Is there an ethical issue there about the government having so much control over the mainstream media and therefore the closing down of any kind of significant debate over these issues?
I mean, I think there would be if it had been sustained. I think obviously all this money that's been spent has been quite helpful in the short run, I think, to media that had financial difficulties in places. But I do think that, again, in the early months, there was sort of wartime atmosphere almost, and there's this feeling everyone should get behind the government, and if the government had to spend a bit of money, then fine. That was how it was. It hasn't lasted, though, and I think the dissent has come. In papers like the Telegraph, the Mail, somewhat. The creation of GB News has turned out there's a massive audience for these opinions. So it hasn't really been possible to kind of hold the line on this. The debate will out, and in the end, media responds to it, I think.
Yeah, and that's something I think we, in a very small way, have benefited from as well. I think it relates to this whole area of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and I think that is one of the things that people found so disturbing over the last couple of years. The sort of sense that any sort of questioning or even sort of speaking out and a different opinion about these things was somehow not only were you sort of in error, but you were somehow being irresponsible and and wrong, and maybe even you were doing something illegal. That was a very disturbing thing to feel. And segueing into a more contemporary issue, it seems to me that we might have a residue of this with the online harms bill that's being proposed at the moment, which appears to me to lump in criminal activities with activities which are not criminal. So, this is to prevent, the proliferation of videotapes of violent crimes, for example, online, but also to prevent the spread of quote unquote COVID misinformation. Where do you think we're at with the question over freedom of speech and public debate in this country? And do you have concerns about the online harms bill?
I mean, I do. I think, in a way, this was the other thing I found so disturbing about the last 2 years, is the way opinion has been, it would be an exaggeration to say it's being controlled, but it's definitely been policed on social media to quite a large extent. And again, one of the sort of odd, unnerving things about all this was the way official opinion has just switched over on certain questions. Like, in the early days, masks didn't work. Now masks do work, even though, as far as I can see, the evidence is pretty marginal at best on that. Or the whole thing of a lab leak, suddenly that became okay to talk about again. I think it will prove to have been very short-termist for the government not to have criticised that much more strongly and stood up for freedom of speech and the right to debate things and the right for accurate information. Because, next time's a major crisis of any kind, whether it's health or whatever, the value of government information has been weakened. People aren't sure whether they're getting accurate information or merely what the government wants to communicate at that point. And that is a real problem, I feel.
It sort of gets worse than that. It hammers into the whole cornerstone of what you're allowed to know, because science is fundamentally a adversarial pursuit, isn't it? You have a hypothesis, you try and disprove it. Is actually the right way around, I believe. You try your darndest to disprove it, and you try your darndest to prove it, and other scientists have a go as well. But if you suddenly find that the government are policing COVID misinformation, you can be sure that the universities will get behind that. You're suddenly those research grants won't be going to those who are questioning the government line, will they? Because that's misinformation. It'll tie through, but our knowledge base will crumble if we do that. It won't.
It's even more extreme, though, isn't it? Because it's criminalising the speech as well.
Yeah.
So it's very extreme. Sorry, Lord Frost, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I do. I have worries about the online bill, I must admit, and I've not properly looked at the detail yet, partly because it keeps changing. But to me, there's a difference between trying to stop happening online something that is unarguably illegal offline, and trying to stop things happening that aren't illegal but is convenient. And I'm not sure we've kind of got that line right, as far as I can tell, with this bill. The whole misinformation seems to become the new word for fake news. Maybe fake news got a bit boring, so there's a new word needed now. But it's kind of, I just don't buy the concept. I mean, I kind of buy a sort of simple level, like there's a fact whether something's red or blue, for example. But at the sort of sophisticated level where you're having political debate, whether something is correct or not sort of depends what you're trying to do. It may be correct for one purpose and very bad for another purpose, and that's what political debate is about. So I just don't think you can bring quite the same standards to this as you do for kind of objective reality. You have to talking about it.
And isn't the case that particularly in British history, minority views, or you might even say heretical views, have been ones in the end that have come round and saved us? It has been that lone scientist or historian or politician who's called out something, and then after a period of time, people have retrospectively said, yeah, that this was the prophetic voice that we needed to hear. And it seems like the policing of all speech and information at that level, we lose something as a society. We lose maybe our innovative edge. That's my own view.
I don't believe you can have a free society, a successful modern society, if you don't allow people to debate things as freely and fully as possible. And it feels like I think it's a really bad sign that we're letting social media.
I noticed that in that respect, those on the edge of some of the the COVID debate, whereas before cranks would have been seen almost in a benign way as part of it's almost part of British culture that that we have these kind of mad dogs and Englishmen types, but now they're quite vicious. The sort of those who have real minority opinions are pushed down, vilified, and othered. And I find that particularly disturbing and anti-British.
I agree, and I think one of the effects is that it marginalizes people who are not cranks but just have a different opinion. And you can see this happening, that people are forced to the extremes all the time, because if you're going to be condemned for a reasonable opinion, then you end up sort of talking to people who have been condemned for all sorts of other maybe less reasonable reasons, and everybody gets in their echo chambers. And you can see that on masks, where I'm always baffled by the attachment of medical establishment to masks. But anyway, I think the reasonable thing to say about masks is that possibly there is a very marginal benefit. I don't think that is outweighed by the downsides of having masks, but that's a perfectly reasonable thing to kind of debate. I definitely come on one side of that debate, but the effect of the way it's been has kind of forced everyone into the extremes, so that for one bunch of people wearing a mask is virtue signaling, and another it's quite the other. And if people can't talk to each other and engage with each other, then it's a very bad sign. We won't get the best solutions, and it's a very bad sign for a cohesive, normal, free society, I think.
How do we encourage re-engagement, would you say? I mean, there's been an awful lot of damage done to civil discourse. Do you have any thoughts on that? How do we do some repairing?
So I think some of it is probably there isn't much we can do about, and the only thing you can do is kind of ignore it. Sort of Twitter wars and this sort of thing can pile on. You've just got to sort of delegitimize it. I think politicians can do a bit by not playing the kind of tactical game of gotcha all the time themselves. The media not playing that. I think politicians now have an ability in formats like this to kind of talk at length, get their views across, try and get people to understand the nuances and the ins and outs and the trade-offs and thing. And it surprises me that more politicians don't use this format, because it's very clear from the market for people like Jordan Peterson and so on, there's a massive market to hear proper discussion about things and engage with it. So I think probably politicians got to take the lead a bit on this. I don't think the mainstream media will very easily. Communicate the arguments, to explain why you've reached your decisions, treat people like adults, and say, some things point one way, some things point another way. This is what we've decided to do, and try and get people to understand.
I just wanted to sort of just briefly dip back into the online safety bill, because one thing that I think I'm surprised that the Conservative Party aren't a bit more concerned about is that, where does, when we have eventually, presumably, another Labour Party or a Liberal Democrat Party who are far more interested in policing speech than, say, the Tory Party traditionally is, the moment you've sort of got a door open to this sort of idea, do they not? I mean, I would be worried that a party might sort of take it a bit further. Maybe someone associated with the Black Lives Matters movement might suddenly sort of criticism of that sort of political movement might become part of the narrative that you're not allowed to there's misinformation. But is there a problem in the values, the core of the Conservative Party? Are they losing grip of what they were? Is a question.
I think actually there's quite a degree of sort of simmering unease, I would say, about this bill that hasn't properly surfaced yet. And I think partly it's people don't want to be kind of at endless war with the leadership. We've just had a massive trauma over COVID and all of that, and so on. So the kind of appetite to take up something else and start another civil war is low. So I think that's part of it. But I do think there's quite a bit of unease, and I think it may yet sort of bubble over. I think there's also the worry. Nobody wants to get on the wrong side of the argument of, people say, oh, okay, so you're in favour of sort of violence on the internet and so on. So it's very easy with the sort of simplified political debate we have to find yourself kind of stigmatised. But I don't think this debate is over yet, is my guess. I think a lot of people see this as probably quite problematic. And I personally think the best thing would be to go back to the drawing board on it and do it properly. But we may have to do the best we can.
Can we talk a little bit about the role of the church, Lord Frost? I want to ask you what your view is on the role that, I suppose specifically, the Church of England has taken over the last couple of years in the particularly the COVID crisis, but in various other political crises as well. And what's your take on that to begin with? And then what would you like to see from bishops in the Church of England and leaders more generally saying and doing over the next couple of years or so?
I think I say anything with caution, because obviously it's I'm not a regular churchgoer. It's not my institution, and I know more about some things than others. I would say, I was trying to think, how would I characterize myself for the purpose of this podcast? And I kind of think of myself as I don't know whether this concept exists, but of a sort of non-practicing believer, if you like. I kind of intellectually accept a lot of Christianity as an explanation of the world and the rich tradition that goes behind it, but I'm sort of put off by the church itself. And certainly what I found over the last couple of years was, at a time when I don't think I was unusual in this, at a time when you're forced to confront questions of life and death and normality and what was life all about. The church just wasn't there, and the church seems to have been quite slow in getting back there as well. I'm sure it varies, but sort of reluctance to open the doors, reluctance to get back to normal on services does seem to be kind of massively variable depending on where you live and kind of local enthusiasm. And that's one thing. I just, when I wanted the church to say something, it didn't seem to want to say anything, and I just feel massively disappointed and frustrated by that. I think the other thing that struck me was just it was a bit what we were saying earlier, the sort of shallowness of the messaging and the way the church became a sort of echo chamber for public health and avoiding risk. And when you think of the depth, 2,000 years depth of Christian theology and explanation of the world, and this is what you get, it just seems so disappointing. And that's what I feel. And I think there are others like that who really want something serious and aren't getting something serious. Unfortunately,
I wish I could take that clip and just play it on a constant loop. Meeting at the moment, because Tom, myself, and Jamie have been, and I think it's no understatement to say, overwhelmed by the number of emails and letters. And I suspect our other halves will say, oh, here's another fan mail come through the post again. And it's almost, what you have said is almost word for word letters that we receive, several times a week in the post, and certainly almost daily in email. This sense, I think Tom Holland, the historian's picked up on this as well, this disappointment that when the moment came for the church to speak into the narrative of fear with the message of hope, we instead got this health and safety echo chamber and the whole sort of supernatural medicine, in a sense, that we had to offer was sort of put to the side. And it's very frustrating because, you know, I can write about this and say this to colleagues and watch them roll their eyes as they go, you know, he's overstating it and that. And our feeling is, you know, looking at the sort of the nation as a whole, that quite a few people have felt what you felt, Lord Frost, and the church missed or is missing an incredible opportunity to engage. We also found we've also had emails from lots of people who've had a movement within themselves towards re-engaging with Christianity. You know, they've sort of come. They might describe themselves as sort of, you know, post-agnostic, and then have struggled to connect with the local church in this because, you know, A, in lockdown it's locked, or B, because the minister just doesn't seem that particularly fired up by their newfound faith. You know, so thank you for what you said, because I think that underlines what we've experienced.
That's so interesting. It's I just think, you know, again, the whole sort of Jordan Peterson phenomenon, a different side of things, just shows that people want something to engage with. They want seriousness when, you know, most of public life is pretty unserious and trivial. And the last 2 years have been a time for seriousness. I mean, if we're not serious, then when are we going to be? And it, you know, so I don't think the church has been unique in this. I just, you know, I sort of wanted more, really, and yet we've got this. You know, the church seems so much to reflect kind of day-to-day political preoccupation, be very managerialist, and doesn't spend a lot of time explaining Christianity to everybody else. And, you know, I'm lucky in a way. I think I'm one of the last generation that was sort of taught the doctrines of Christianity at school and went through university and so on. But a lot of people just don't seem to know. You know, the fundamentals are simply not there, and it feels like a huge failure and disappointment. But
I think part of the issue is that, in all seriousness, the church has done its best to. You said you quite rightly spoke about 2,000 years of ethical thinking that we could have brought to this, and yes, I think we can. But the church has done its best to forget its past in the last, say, 30, 40 years. I mean, that's seriously been a project of sort of liberal Protestantism, which sort of infested the Church of England in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and so we lost the liturgy that had that sort of direct connection with the past. We lost a lot of the sort of structures in the church that spoke to them. We also lost the sort of sense of an Anglican identity in our training and in our ministry, in pursuit of sort of ecclesiastical union, which is all very well, but we sort of, there's a sense in which, you know, the Church of England has lost part of its soul, and has rejected part of its birthright, and is giving quite thin gruel to a lot of parishes around the country. I mean, this was a problem before the pandemic, and I think the pandemic has highlighted it. We have leaders who found something they believed in more than the resurrection of Christ, which appears to be, you know, stay at home, wear a mask, and wash your hands. Which is sad.
It's very sad.
But the mental health landscape is quite awful subsequently, and that faith can speak very directly into that with the message of, you know, the message of hope and transcendent truths. And I've noticed even just this last couple of days, that Synod is talking about mental health on a mental health, using mental health jargon, fair enough, but it's talking about mental health in the context of mental health rather than mental health in the context of spiritual health. And that strikes me again as, I think, as Tom's saying, that this kind of progressive virus, like a computer virus, has gone through the church to poo-poo
spiritual.
The spiritual, yeah.
You get it in the sort of in the realm of those people who are set aside to perform exorcisms. There's still, the chances are, if you go to your sort of spiritual, I can't remember what they're called in modern jargon, but the sort of people who might be experienced with sort of praying for relief and from evil. And the chances are you find someone who doesn't really believe that what they're doing is necessary, or that there are any, evil entities that affect people. You're thinking, well, Christ spent most of his life, an awful lot of his life, casting out demons. I mean, I'm not saying that we ought to return to a position where we ignore, the advances of health and psychology and the way that can help people, but to completely abandon the idea that people can be, affected by evil beings that are not human is to abandon again that sort of heritage. I don't know. It's one example.
Brilliant sermon essay by C.S. Lewis, and I'm sure you all know, Transposition, where the concept is that any higher thing, if you try and express it in the lower thing, will initially look like the lower thing, and it takes sort of discernment to realize that they're different. And these seem to be quite good cases of that sometimes they are just mental health issues, but sometimes there's a lot more to it. And if you're just using the same sort of secular language about it, then you're missing something kind of really important. Like when you hear, a Beethoven symphony played in a piano reduction, it's sort of the same thing, but it sort of isn't. That's not what it was about.
Yeah. Do you think there's a sense in which the church is not, I'm speaking specifically about the Church of England here, is that we're not really fulfilling our role as an established church? And what I mean here is that it seems to me that we've been acting more as a state church during this, certainly the last couple of years, where we've just been kind of ratifying the diktats of the state. And really, it seems to me that the difference between a state church and an established church is that an established church is attempting to have some kind of benign and leavening effect on society, and I would say in this instance as well, political life. So we do seem to have a problem, or at least I would say it very much appears to be a problem with ethics in public life. And we're all sick to the teeth really of talking about Partygate and all this kind of stuff, but certain other things as well, Matt Hancock and various other, Neil Ferguson is another example, and so on and so forth. And there's generally speaking high levels of cynicism about ethics in public life. I mean, is this another area where the church has missed a trick, where we could have had something to say to help almost to bring that leavening effect? And again, we haven't done it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there are various ways of this. I think, what does being an established church mean? It's that, in some ways that it's recognition of the belief that, in a good society, there should be a spiritual religious element to it, and that, a well-run country, that is kind of a good element of making people feel at home in that country and respected and so on. But at the same time, that obviously isn't the point. The point of Christianity is it true or not? And if it is, how does it affect your life? And I think some of that maybe to get across would be good. It's not just about what's convenient or about what's effective for society, but is it true, and should you try and live your life like that or not. And that sort of idea seems to have been kind of lost, and some of the basic concepts of, you know, sort of fallen man and original sin that you might in a kind of theologically aware society bring to some of these problems of day-to-day ethical behavior. People aren't at that starting point, and that's why I say I think, you know, people don't understand the doctrines, and it's very hard to you know, kind of bring that to some of these problems when people aren't at first base. But that's basically what I think. You know, the established church it is important to society, but that isn't the point of the church. The point of the church is to lead people to how they live their lives, and, you know, something better.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I feel that we should assemble some bishops and get you to have a word with them.
Well, I mean, the obvious one is that letter from the Bishop of London, isn't it, where she says, she comments on looking to spring with hope, and we were thinking, we don't look to spring with hope, we look to Christ risen, yes. You know, promise with hope, you know, not to the season. It just wouldn't go amiss in a public statement to have a little bit of theology, Christian theology. You know, it doesn't have to just be a cut and paste of a government.
Press I thought that was very striking. Yeah. You're right. Yeah.
Lord Frost, we don't want to take up too much of your time. We thank you for being so generous, but perhaps we could ask a final question. I'm interested to know what's next for you now that your government responsibilities are finished for a time. What's coming up for you personally?
So I'm not sure yet. I'll do a bit of writing and journalism, I hope, not just about Europe and Brexit, but try and range a bit more widely. I'll do some work with some think tanks, I think, try and speak a bit, this sort of thing. So I want to remain in public life. I'm not desperate to kind of, you know, not the opportunities arisen, but I'm not sort of desperate to kind of go back into government. I feel I've sort of learned quite a lot over the last decade or two, and I've become quite reflective myself about what that's taught me and how things ought to be done. And I would quite like to get some of that across and try and shape opinion on things. So that's probably where it's going to take me for a bit, I think.
Well, I think we'd all, I'm sure Tom and Daniel would agree with me when I say that we hope that you have a massive influence, and that sensible and reflective and deep voices like yours are heard more widely in society, because it's certainly what we need at the moment. Well, thank you. I'll do my best, and I think it is this has been really interesting conversation, just to sort of develop some of the thoughts that I don't normally get space to talk about, and it's been great. So thank you for having me, and it's been wonderful to talk. And do stay in touch somehow. Well, yeah, absolutely. Welcome back anytime, of course. Thank you for your encouragement. Yes. No, you've done an amazing job, really, and I think you reach many more people than you realize, and just keep it up. Thank you so much. Well, Lord Frost, on that note, we'll say thank you and goodbye for now. God bless. Yeah. Thank you very much. See you again. Okay, well, there it is. I hope everyone found that really, really interesting. I mean, it was weird, wasn't it, Daniel? I mean, it was great. I don't want to say it was in this negatively at all, but the hour for me, it just flashed past. I think it was because I was kind of like in a heightened state of consciousness. I really was trying to sort of do the best that I could in order to get as much out of it of the hour as we possibly could. And so it was almost like a timeless experience for me. He was so generous in his time beforehand, off show, in terms of preparing for this. I know you and he particularly did quite a lot of work in thinking through where the conversation might go. Yeah. So absolutely. And as I say, just his modesty and his openness was amazing, really. I mean, another thing to say is he contacted us. He didn't ask to come on. I asked him to come on, but it's just amazing, really amazing thing. Let's talk a little bit about what he said. I mean, let's talk about the political stuff first. The way I'd characterize his stuff on COVID is I think he basically thinks that the government made a huge mistake, but the other governments were making similar mistakes. And it would have been incredible. He said at one point, it would have taken a huge amount of political will, and it would have involved a huge amount of risk for us to do anything else, as they did, for example, in Sweden. So he's saying basically he thinks we made a big mistake, but that in some ways, he didn't quite say it like this, but in some ways it's kind of understandable that it happened at first. But then he went on to say the fact that it continued and repeated itself over and over again was something that he found intolerable. Is that your reading, more or less, Daniel, of what he said?
Yeah. I thought it aligned very well with Toby Young's recent podcast, where he picked up on this. A sense that it would have been very difficult for the British government to have aped Sweden in its response. Because of the sheer international pressure, but that there was a sense in which that we all got stuck in governments got stuck in this narrative. The needle on the record player was just going round and round without moving on, and that sort of surprise, that sort of element of fear surprised us all. And clearly surprised him. Yeah,
I suppose for me it sort of leaves me the question of, well, even if what he says is correct, where does that leave us in terms of our evaluation of what happened? I mean, I don't think it's an excuse to say that because everyone else was doing it, it somehow makes it okay for us to have done it as well. Sweden shows us that it didn't inevitably need to be this way. And, Boris had a stonking majority in the Houses of Parliament. We are a more traditional and conservative society than, for example, France or Germany or Austria. And so you'd think if any country in the world could have given a lead, it could have been us. So, I do think that it was a terrible mistake, and I think the leaders. I think it will look very, very bad for the leaders in years to come. Everyone who participated in it. So I understand what he's saying, and in some ways, I can see that analysis has quite a lot of explanatory power. But nevertheless, I still think it was a terrible mistake, and it was deeply immoral, and particularly, as he says, to keep on compounding the error by repeating it over and over again, and by essentially gaslighting anyone who brought any objection.
Yeah, Toby was more explicit, wasn't he? That he said that for politicians, particularly for, let's say, someone like Boris, and Lord Frost wasn't going to obviously be personal to that degree. There's a risk aversion where to have, in this case, not done anything would have had potentially, if that had gone wrong, and millions of people start dying, that would have been the feed-in from sage scientists. You're going to pay for this for the rest of your life. You're going to be hounded out of Downing Street. So like sort of trench warfare in the First World War, it's for God's sake, do something. And the problem is that something in this case is potentially, now with hindsight, not really the path that should have been taken.
Yeah, well, it shows you. I mean, I think these politicians often need to have a crash course in the art of doing nothing, because sometimes nothing is not only the best thing you can do, it's the only thing you should do. And it sort of reminds me of the tactics. It's a bit of a maybe slightly tenuous connection, but it reminds me of the tactics of General Kutuzov when Napoleon he entered Russia, when he invaded Russia. Kutuzov's tactics after the Battle of Austerlitz, I think it was simply to retreat from Moscow. So Moscow was lost, but then he just didn't engage with Napoleon. Napoleon's troops began to starve, and they had to withdraw from Russia. So sometimes you've just got to do nothing and say, well, doing nothing is, there are negative consequences sometimes. Kutuzov lost Moscow for a time, and it was there was a huge amount of destruction there and loss for the Russians, but overall it was the right decision. And people need to, we need to realize, I think, that doing nothing is a serious political option a lot of the time. So I think
I was thinking about that this morning, actually. I don't know if you've seen, Jamie, but Justin Trudeau stormed out of Parliament.
Dear.
As, of course, the truckers outside are making this incredible protest of hundreds of thousands of people and thousands of trucks. And it struck me that now is the time for them to hold their nerve and do nothing.
Yes.
Because he will clearly take political advantage if this all goes a bit January the 6th, like in Washington. That would be the last and worst thing that could happen. But actually, they want to go deeper into making this more carnivalesque and joyful and peaceful, and just hanging out. I think that will have more momentum than anything else. And as calls him, Pinocchio will be nothing but intensely irritated and cornered.
I think those truckers, they've I don't know anything about the organizers. I've not really heard any interviews, but they do seem to have their heads on straight. And in many ways, I think the January 6th thing is actually helpful, because people can point to that and say, look, we will not repeat that mistake. This is a peaceful protest, and we need to make, not only must it be peaceful, but it must be obvious to everyone in the world that this is a peaceful protest, that there's no violence, there's no dodgy far right ideological aspect to it. It's simply a protest. It's a cross political, it's a sort of ecumenical protest, and what we want is our freedom back, and we want to be released from this authoritarianism, and we want the Charter of Rights to be respected.
Ecumenical, but it's not very Anglican, unfortunately, in its protest, because as I don't know if you saw the email that we received today from a Canadian, which pointed out that various ecclesiastical authorities who beat the progressive drum have closed their doors. You can't even go for a wee in the cathedral, and I think one of the local bishops there has been quite vitriolic about the whole thing, and here is the great instance of class war for progressives and uber liberals, and they've been found like the emperor without their clothes. They've got nothing to say if not the negative. However, if it was a BLM protest, it might be a slightly different narrative.
Oh, it would be totally different.
What's interesting in Canada as well, Jamie, is that it would appear that the Conservative opposition is coalescing behind the truckers, and of course there are other notables like Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, and others. So Pinocchio is having his strings entangled quite badly at the moment.
I think he's in a huge amount of trouble, and I welcome it, to be honest, because I think he's.
They've just got to do nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they will starve the government of oxygen, and it will be untenable for them. They also this week, let's talk about Frost again, Lord Frost, in a minute. But they also Trudeau, it seems, put pressure on GoFundMe to at first try and steal the money that people, I think it was 9 million Canadian dollars, people had donated to help the truckers in their protest. Firstly, they said they were going to steal it and give it to other charities who are probably quite progressive. And then because they realized that this would probably look quite bad to steal $9 million, they decided they were going to give it back to people who gave it. But it's absolutely shameful, and it just shows you
use cash where possible.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But it just shows you how, big tech is playing a huge role in this. And we can only, I was listening to Dave Rubin's show yesterday. I think he's exactly right. All we can do is set up alternative structures. They want to have complete, their ideal is to have complete control of the internet. So, you and I can't have conversations online, and people can't fundraise for political causes that they disagree with. No, the internet is a place of freedom and true free political exchange, and it needs to remain that way. But Daniel, let's go back to talk about David Frost. One of the things that I thought was remarkable was I can't remember what he said it in answer to. I think I asked him how do we restore trust or something like that, and he said something like, politicians need to start treating people as adults. They need to have proper conversations. They need to come on podcasts like this one and have long conversations where they give their honest opinion about things. Now, I found that incredibly refreshing.
Yeah, I think that demonstrates how maybe if I use this sort of political jargon, in the post-liberal world, the podcast is king.
Yep.
And that folks have an appetite for lengthy, in-depth dialogue and conversation, because wasn't that what it was all about? But instead, It's interesting, again, from the progressive end of the political spectrum, and this is true also within the churches, it's become, instead it's the soundbite. It's the 30-second, it's the 2-minute hate.
Yep.
And we're offering them the 2-hour love, of extensive dialogue and unpacking and sense meaning and all of that. And I find that interesting that the internet is sort of polarizing in that way. And yes, I think he was right to highlight, where are the politicians on the podcast when there are these opportunities to unpack at some length your political philosophy?
It seems to me that there are at least two choices here. I mean, the first choice is to act like a typical politician, like the kind of thing you see on Yes Minister, and be guarded in every single political utterance you engage in, to plan your statements ahead of time, and basically to try and sort of slither your way up the greasy pole by never really revealing what you think about anything, and trying to manipulate people into thinking that you're a good politician or a good person or whatever. There's that way of doing things. And then there's the way which I think is ultimately more successful, not least because you keep your soul and your integrity in doing it. And that's just to be honest, just to say what you think about things, and not to worry if you overstep the mark slightly, or you say something, with slightly the wrong inflection or something like that. People want honesty, and they want depth, and they want straight talking, and they know when they're being lied to, and they know when people are trying to pull the wool over their eyes. And it's the same. I'm sure you'd agree, Daniel. It's the same thing in the church. We need to be honest with people. We need to look people in the eyes. We need to listen to their questions. We need to respond not like politicians, but primarily and first and fundamentally like human beings. And this is the way I believe that you can really connect with people, and you can really make a difference in the world. The other way, you might be able to promote yourself, but ultimately that's all you're doing. You're not really going to do anything if you relate to people like that. And of course, I'd put Lord Frost, absolutely in the secondary category there. And the other thing is, I really think this thing about patronizing people is so key. It's like, well, if you try and introduce something that's like mildly difficult to understand, or if you have a conversation which lasts for more than 10 seconds, the people they're too stupid and their attention span is too short. No, it's not. Joe Rogan recently did an interview with Jordan Peterson, which lasted for over 4 hours.
It's awesome. I mean, I just listened to a bit that they did on the cross and the serpents in the wilderness. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. There were gems in that you could take to almost anyone. I mean, I thought, gosh, you could play that in a secondary school assembly, or PHSE lesson, RE lesson, and there would be a kind of depth of conversation that probably students have not had access to for a very long time. It's interesting, isn't it? That in the Blair years, the whole thing was about media manipulation and management of the message.
Spin.
That was spin, and how many of our institutions took on spin with this hysteria that if the message isn't managed, it's all going to fall apart, which is in itself very patronizing of how we think about ordinary people. And the thing is, as you pick out, folks smell a rat. They realize that what they're being given is synthetic and not real. Yeah,
they do absolutely. I totally agree, and I'm absolutely against spin. I hate it. I find it appalling, and I think as a church we've got to reject it. We've got to go back to face-to-face communication, honest communication, and treat, as Lord Frost said, treat people like adults. Speaking of the church, I think his comments when we asked about this were, again, devastating. So he started off by saying basically that he sort of accepts, in a kind of propositional way, I suppose, what Christianity says about the nature of the universe. But he actually said the words, "The church puts me off." And I think that is something that we need to, you and I, as well as anyone else, Daniel, we need to take that to heart. That needs to cut us to the heart. You've got people like that who would be interested, who basically is saying, I believe it, but I don't want to engage with the representatives, or the kind of official representatives, if you like, of this message. And how many more of them are there?
All the time.
Yeah.
And the worrying thing is look at, say, the Church of England's current trajectory. It appears as if what the attempt is to massage and spin the church into being attractive to a very small number of social justice warriors, when there are millions of Lord David Frosts who are just saying, if you go down that line, it's going to be anathema.
Yeah,
that's what you want. If that's what you want, then this organization is not for me.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, we were just talking about treating people like adults, and the attempt to connect with this, putative social justice generation is, again, it's very, very patronizing, and it's done in a way which really lacks understanding of young people and the way that they think. And I would say that demographic in general, it's not likely. Well, I think it's highly unlikely that it will actually be successful in any way. Sorry, Daniel, go ahead.
Painful, to be honest, to watch, because
they're just not cool, are they? They're just, they're like a bunch of 60-year-old white men trying to pretend. Well, I don't know what they're trying to pretend to be, but they're certainly not being themselves, are they?
No. Well, and that's been an issue with that generation for a while,
right? Yeah. Well, I mean, it's again, he was talking about shallowness of the message. He was saying that you have depth. It was interesting, wasn't it? Depth in your tradition. You've got 2,000 years of Christian reflection and intellectual depth to draw on. And what we get is this kind of thin gruel, this sort of echoing of secular political pronouncements. And what the church should actually be doing is concentrating on the message of the gospel and of its, he was talking about doctrines, wasn't he? He was saying, when was the last time you heard anyone talk about original sin, or I can't remember the other examples he gave, but, the cross or whatever, or the incarnation. It's like, that's what we should be talking about. Yes, he's right. He's right.
Well, I think that's where the connection that, say, Jordan Peterson has made, and I know that was this came out on the Joe Rogan podcast, when he said the problem. I've come to realize that the problem of the world, all the problems of the world, really are about me.
Yeah,
I am the problem. That I have to take the finger and turn it onto myself as the starting point. I have to look within and say, stop judging the speck in your brother's eye and look at the beam in your own. And that is so antithetical to all the critical theories, the progressive ideology, the woke subculture that the church is trying to take in unto itself. And here we have this agnostic psychologist saying, no, that cannot be your starting point. Your starting point has to be yourself and getting your own room in order.
Yeah.
Why aren't we hearing that, Jamie,
yeah,
from the church, when this is a message that is really getting traction? Because people know deep down in their hearts that this is actually true, real,
it's there in the Sermon on the Mount, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's part of the teaching of Christ, and somebody like Peterson is picking it up. He's tapping into something which is true and is part of reality. And it's almost like, when I hear people like Lord Frost or Jordan Peterson or whoever it might be, who is not, these people aren't sort of traditional in any sort of traditional sense, sort of Christians, who are part of the church or anything like that. It's like the Lord is raising up prophetic voices outside of the church, almost to call us, I would say, to repentance and to the basics of our faith, to have confidence in our message. Because if people who are outside of the church can, go on Joe Rogan and reach an audience of 10 million people or however many it is in one, is it more than that? Is it 100 million who listen to the show? Anyway, millions and millions of people who listen to the show in one stroke. And he's talking about foundational aspects of Christian faith. We're not talking about, doctrinal depths here. We're talking about simple, read them off the surface teachings of Jesus Christ. Remove the log from your own eye before you look at the speck in your brother's. If he can do that, why can't we do something similar? We're not even scratching the surface. We're not doing anything compared to somebody like Peterson. We're hardly reaching anyone, even with this podcast.
Yeah.
Okay? So
we know because we've had the emails of people who being fired up by this, and they go to their local church and they start talking to the incumbent about this, and he or she just rolls their eyes and says, this isn't a place for that kind of sort of Peterson bigotry.
Yeah, sign up to the climate change seminar, and come along to the Black Lives Matter discussion group, and then we can gradually deprogram you, and you can realize that this is all a bit silly. But I mean, I think I don't know. I find it deeply chastening, Daniel, and I don't want to sort of, it would be a mistake, wouldn't it? It would be an ironic mistake if we just said, all right, well, we're going to point the finger to the rest of the church and say the rest of the church is wrong. We have to apply this in our own ministries and our own approach thing. We have to take it deeply to heart, and also I think we have to guard against institutional capture in our own hearts, and to really examine ourselves honestly.
Well, it's constantly in there, isn't it?
Yeah. And to think, well, am I dissembling? Am I being faithful to what God is really calling me to do, or am I playing the game? Am I willing to take the consequences of speaking the truth and of delivering the prophetic message as I should do? So that's the kind of thing, I hope that I'll be able to ask myself going forward. And Daniel, speaking of which, shall we move on to Scripture now? I think before we do, we should say, if there are people who are new watching the show, do subscribe to the show on YouTube or on your podcatcher. Because we'd love you to come back, and we'd love you to become a part of the Irreverend family. We're also on Twitter at Irreverend Pod, and we have a Telegram channel as well, t.me/Irreverend Pod. So please join us on those things. And if you'd like to support the show, you can do it on patreon.com/Irreverend. And we really appreciate everyone who supports us, everyone who follows us, everyone who interacts with us, leaves comments, sends emails, irreverendpod@gmail.com. We love to hear from people, and this is what makes doing this worthwhile, because we genuinely want to make a difference and to connect and to see revival in the church, renewal in our nation as well. So speaking of which, sticking to our convictions, we're now going to read a portion of Scripture and to try and see what it has to say to us. So in my lectionary reading, I think it was yesterday, we're at Acts chapter 17, beginning at verse 16. And this is the Apostle Paul in Athens at the Areopagus, which is a place of debate and exchange of ideas. So I'll just read some of this. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who chanced to be there. Some also of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers met him. And some said, "What would this babbler say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he preached Jesus and the resurrection. And they took hold of him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is which you present? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the middle of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all men life and breath and everything. And he made from one every nation of men to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their habitation, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel after him and find him. Yet he is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. Even some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, a representation by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all men by raising him from the dead. I really like this passage, Daniel. I think it's got a lot to say to us today. Paul, in a place of it's a non-Jewish context, so it's a Gentile context. There are various ideas flying around. There are Epicureans, there are Stoics, there are people exchanging ideas, and then Paul comes into this, and they give him an opportunity, and he's really ready to take it. He's ready to take this opportunity, which is great. And again, it's like we've been talking about, it's an example to us that, as the Apostle Peter says, we should always be ready to give an explanation for the hope that is within us. And then he makes some fantastic connections with the culture. So he observes the altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. And he thinks to himself, well, if these people say they believe in some kind of God, but they don't know what this God is, I will proclaim it to them. So again, in our culture, a lot of the time people have a sense of transcendence. They have a sense that there is something more, something divine behind nature, behind we would say creation, I suppose. Are we ready to help people to start making those connections? Are we ready to sort of put some flesh on the bones, as the Apostle Paul is? The other thing he does is he makes a connection with their poetry. So he actually quotes, according to this account, verbatim phenomena by Epimenides. So, this would be the equivalent of being very sort of au fait with intellectual or cultural trends today, and being able to quote them and make intelligent connections with them, and in a way which is convincing for people. So I think there's that thing there about cultural engagement, and this is an excellent example of that. I think also there's a sense in which this is an affirmation of pagan culture to a certain extent. Now, the Apostle Paul clearly didn't affirm all of pagan culture. There are passages where he condemns much of it, but nevertheless, it does seem to give us a warrant for seeing in culture, outside of the church, outside of Christianity, points at which it connects with the truth, or says something real, or says something true. It reminds me of a statement by Francis Schaeffer, who said, all truth is God's truth. And so looking for those connections between culture and the ultimate truth is incumbent upon us as Christians. And then the final thing is, in his sort of main chunk of text, he says this thing which again, I think is a kind of affirmation of all culture in verse 27, where he says that God made people, he allotted the periods and the boundaries of their habitation, verse 27, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel after him and find him. So I think there's a kind of affirmation there of a sort of natural theology almost that God puts in all. It's not like we're sort of all spiritually hopeless and we've got no way of even thinking about God at all, as I would say certain theologians probably, I think it's fair to say, like Karl Barth would have said, but actually God's put it within us to seek him, to feel our way. The sort of Greek there has a sort of sense of groping after God. So it's not like, without that full revelation of Christ, you can fully grasp hold, but nevertheless, you can grasp after him, you can grope after him, and you can feel him. And he does say also, and find him as well. So I think there's something there about the goodness of culture, about connecting with culture, and about doing it confidently and intelligently. So,
and the New Testament has no epistle to the Athenians.
No.
A friend of mine makes the conclusion from that this speech, though noble, never became the engine for forming a church in Athens, and that it demonstrates maybe then that we have to preach in good season and bad, and that sometimes the fruit of our work in this is not immediate, and in fact, if we seek as Christian ministers immediate gratification, we could actually put ourselves in spiritual danger. And I think there are a number of mega churches around the world that have fallen into this trap of basically giving people candy for spirituality. But clearly there is a church in Athens now, but it maybe took several generations to gain root. But initially he gets nowhere. He builds Corinth and Ephesus, in other places, but he's heroic in his persistence.
Yes, indeed, and that's something that does really come across in the book of Acts. So the response is that some mock him, some say, "We'll hear you again," and then a handful of people join him. So I think you're right, is that the response actually appears to have been underwhelming.
It's a little handful, but that was a tiny seed.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, his persistence and his courage is something you see over and over again. And again, Daniel, the amount of times he's arrested, beaten, driven out of the city, it just underlines to me this, the nonsense that, we should never ever upset anyone and never cause anyone any offense. I mean, it's just, look at the Apostle Paul.
It's not Niceanity, it's Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, we don't, you don't set out to cause offense, but the gospel is offensive. The cross is a scandal, and it's a scandal to Jew and to Greek. So we shouldn't be surprised about that. So that's a bit of scriptural reflection. Daniel, we should now finally talk about some news. Okay, so just quickly, it looks like all the COVID restrictions are going to be lifted at the end of February, a month early. That appears to be, well, I think you could interpret it pretty cynically as an attempt by Boris Johnson to save his political life. But nevertheless, good news.
Yeah.
And well, I think, Dan, we talked about this so much that let's not talk about it very much today. I think we just welcome that, and that's great. Let's talk about, honestly, I mean, Daniel, I think this is, going from Lord Frost, the sublime, to the ridiculous. There's an article in the Times, and I know you've written an article about this in Unheard as well, which is a very good article, and I put it on the show notes. Behold the Bishop of Brexit as church models itself on politics.
I thought you should become the Bishop of COVID,
Well, somebody on Twitter suggested that there should be a bishop for the promotion of biblical orthodoxy. And I think that would be a good thing. So let's just tell people what's happening for people who don't know. Church leaders could be appointed to full-time cabinet-style roles such as Brexit bishop or COVID bishop under proposals seen by the Times for the biggest overhaul of how the Church of England is run in centuries. The ecclesiastical map of England could be redrawn via mergers between 42 dioceses, the creation of new constituencies for bishops based on cities or counties, and the appointment of senior regional bishops to oversee large areas of the country. The church has been accused of wanting to form a shadow government because of proposals that some senior bishops could be detached from geographical regions to serve as spokesmen or women on political matters. Daniel, you're not impressed by this, as you wrote in Unheard?
It's this rush to top-down solution, isn't it, for everything? That again is, I think it's sort of part of the Blair generation type of government, which sees that we need huge government, just as we have big church, big government, we need big church.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that all of this, not all do these initiatives cost and take up time. It creates a distance between the person in the pew and those at the top. And what you need really is structures where that distance is small.
Yep.
And that there's actually, to use the irony here, isn't it? To use this EU word subsidiarity, and the EU was anything but subsidiarity in terms of its governance, because everyone felt it was, a sort of huge talk shop. That's the problem, and the energies are taken elsewhere, and it's I think this is just grasping at straws, really. And as we said to Lord Frost, 3 guys with an iPhone each can just talking for an hour a week, look at the impact that they can have, and contrast that with endless projects and initiatives. What typically happens in the church is that, we've got a problem with, say, renewal. So we'll appoint a renewal enabler. And then the renewal enabler then needs an office, it needs secretarial, and then it's very hard for that supernumerary person to get into the life and blood of a diocese. So they'll send endless paperwork to you, trying to get you to respond, to make, in a sense, their job seem worthwhile.
Yep.
So democratic feedback loop that you end up in.
Yeah, I totally agree. Is this a response to decline, Daniel?
Is it a response?
Yeah. Is this so what's behind that question? They're saying, this is based on the changing demographic patterns of the country and so on and so forth. But ultimately, this is a response to decline, isn't it? It's about trying to cut costs, have mergers so that we can become more sustainable, because the Church of England is in decline. Resources are declining, finance is declining. And it's the same thing as, it's the same kind of move as putting vicars in charge of multiple parishes.
Yeah. It's the Judean People's Front, isn't it? Monty Python. I know some people find that film offensive, but there are parts of it that are very cut to British culture, very close to the bone. For goodness sake, do something, Reg.
Yeah.
We'll minute that and put that down on the agenda for next week. It's the endless talk shopping. Whereas I think, again, what Jordan Peterson has shown us is that if you actually speak directly into the narrative and tell people that the simple message of, go back to your room and clean it, that's your first step of spirituality. This is why this person, though agnostic, talking up Christianity ends up filling auditoriums. Now, why? And he said it himself. Why are prelates and senior clergy not doing this? Because this formula works. And I think if we end up endlessly trying to tinker with the structures, then we're on for hiding for nothing. I mean, it didn't come out in the unheard edit, but my initial edit, I said we need to start with a working party in the Church of England for the apocalypse.
Yeah,
particularly with Russia and Ukraine. I was sort of being facetious, but an apocalypse is a revealing of things as they actually are, and a living as if we only have one day left. And I think we don't have the luxury to be endlessly moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. What we need to do is to repair the hull, get people in the lifeboats, and we need to act decisively in that way, and get out and give that message. And you don't need much technology to do that. You don't need enormous secretariats or bishops with supernumerary roles. You can just talk into a phone, or you can go out and walk in the street and talk to people, and that will gain traction.
Yeah, but you actually have to have something to say if you're going to do those things, which I suspect is the real problem. Some theological comments on this. The idea of detaching bishops from their geographical location and giving them political assignments instead, excuse me, my phone just started ringing, is anathema, I would say, to 2,000 years of Christian ecclesiological tradition. The bishop's role originally was basically the same as a parish priest. He became more of a regional overseer when the church began to proliferate, and you needed overseers of geographical locations. But bishops have never had these kind of ideological or political or even specific concerns to speak about. The bishop is father of the church, to provide pastoral oversight, care, to be a defender of the faith, not to speak about single political issues like Brexit or COVID. So I'm deeply concerned about this.
Isn't it? It's clericalism. I'm not an expert on anything much, so I doubt many clergy are. Yeah, but this is for the laity. This is what we need to be doing, is empowering them to be good Christians in their communities.
Yeah,
and the problem is we're failing at even doing that.
Yeah, I agree. So rather than my suggestion, Daniel, would be, rather than detaching bishops from their localities, there should be a greater identification between bishops and their localities. Lots of the problems that are cited, for example, in the article in the Church Times about this, would actually be solved if this happened. So they're talking about, for example, the expense of diocesan offices, the expense of running diocese of that kind of central in that sort of centralized way, problems with demographics and all this kind of stuff. Well, look, here's what we could do, is we could just abolish diocesan offices, just get rid of them. And the bishops, there aren't very many bishops, there are only, how many, like 52, I think it is. Take the bishops, give them churches. They should be parish priests as well as bishops. And then they could do their job as parish priests, and they could provide pastoral care for the priests who live in the diocese. They could go around and they could support, and they could actually be on the ground. They'd be with parishioners, and they'd be involved in real hands-on ministry. You'd cut hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds in expense every year. It's not to say you couldn't have diocesan resources. You could, but it would be decentralized. So of course you need people to run your properties and stuff like that, but outsource it. They don't all need to be in a massive office, which costs millions and millions of pounds to run every year. Decentralize, get the bishops connected once again with the people, doing real ministry, engaging with the depths of the faith, and then they'll have an impact. That will reconnect them with their own spirituality, with their own humanity, and it will dilute this nasty institutional feeling that the church is increasingly taking upon itself, and which is, as you say quite rightly, Daniel, just completely counterproductive to what we want to do, which is ultimately
to want us to be second-rate Liberal Democrats, with the greatest respect to Liberal Democrats, that they want us to be able to give. There's even Underhill said, isn't it? The one thing that we can do well is God, and talk about God. And that's what people want. And then the problem is that we've had theology for the last 40, 50 years has poo-pooed that, and poo-pooed the supernatural, the spiritual. it's all been about, social justice gospel. Okay, fair enough to some degree, but it's been overwhelming and overpowering to the point where, people come to us to want to talk about prayer, and we've got nothing to give, or about things of God and the gospel, and that's what they want. And maybe for some clergy that's a bit boring, but I'm afraid that's
kind of our job, isn't it?
That's our bread and butter.
Well, speaking of bread and butter, that would be like a chef not being interested in food. It's like that's what you're supposed to be doing. That's your job. Speaking of which, Daniel, you wanted to reflect on some comments by the Archbishop of Canterbury in General Synod.
Well, yes. I think you're probably going to pick up from my tone a certain disappointment in this, because we know from others who have written to Archbishop Welby that the Lambeth Palace mailbag over the last 6 weeks or so has been busy with this. That particularly since his pre-Christmas speech, where he politely brandished, by implication, the unvaccinated as immoral. Now, in the General Synod talk, his opening speech, he said this, several paragraphs in: a key lesson of COVID has been unequivocally the illusion of individualism, and the atomization is just that, an illusion, a fallacy. The very nature of a virus is that it is contagious or infectious. It needs many people to spread and thrive. We've had to realize how we are connected in all sorts of ways, from staying home to bulk buying supplies, to getting the vaccine, to wearing a mask. The message was clear: our actions affect other people. We cannot do that. We cannot do what we want without it having an impact on someone else. Now, then he goes on to say, however, in the debate over vaccination especially, it is noticeable that individuals and groups talk extensively about their own rights, needs and wants, as though they are still entirely autonomous.
As though they are still concerned about their physical well-being. How outrageous. Sorry, Daniel, go on. Go ahead.
I suppose I'm trying to highlight is, and this has been really difficult because the people who have written to Lambeth Palace have got the Archbishop thanks you for your letter, yada, 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 yada.
Doesn't reply. It's his policy not to reply, basically.
Yeah, rather than an actual engagement, which I find striking in that, there's all this jargon about celebrating difference and having productive conversations. And yet this dialectic is not being allowed on this particular subject, even a crack opening in the door. But on this particular point from his talk, it struck me, he's failing to understand that our individual liberties, talking extensively about my rights, and my autonomy, is fundamental to the common good. Me talking about my rights and wanting to protect those rights is not selfish. It's about enshrining one of the key elements of Western liberal democracy. And we can think of all the UN charters and statutes and rights and laws since Magna Carta onwards. It's not selfish, it's quite the reverse. I've got a box over there with my grandfather's war medals. He went to the beaches at Normandy for individual rights, for people's autonomy. And I find it so one-dimensional that from the top of the church, this debate is being presented as well. Oh, well, if you're thinking just about your own rights and your own needs, then somehow that is morally cowardly. Whereas really, I think what the danger of what the Archbishop is presenting is a sort of moral collectivism, which is not really where our society has come from. And furthermore, when we look, you and I know this, don't we, that the people who have argued otherwise with us have done so often at personal expense, by running against the narrative, by putting their hand up and saying, but, can I just ask this? I don't necessarily agree with this. And what about such and such? That is not, to me, moral cowardice.
No, a lot of the time this costs people.
And I'm surprised with the lockdown narrative as well, which we see in many parts of the media is beginning to crumble. What is the church going to do? If in months to come, it becomes very obvious that the lockdown narrative has completely crumbled. Are they just going to say, "Oh well, whoopsie"?
Yeah.
That's my rant for the day.
Well, it's a great rant. I loved it. I mean, the thing about this speech, Daniel, is it part of it is that it's just so intellectually pedestrian. So anyone who knows anything about political philosophy will understand the tension here between the individual and the collective, right? So it's a perennial tension in society, all societies. So, for example, in Greece, which, we're told is the birthplace of democracy, there was democracy of a sort, but it was a democracy that was located in the political arena, which was it was a limited arena. Only certain types of people could engage in it. And it was by our standards, it was a highly authoritarian culture. So I'm just giving that as an example. The point being that you can't just say, well, the way to solve this perennial tension or dialectic between the individual and the collective is just to emphasize the collective, because look at societies that have tried that. Look what happens. I mean, apart from anything else, the church does not, didn't fare well in Soviet Russia, did it? So, if you want to give the state that level of authority and to say that it's immoral to question it, well, then apart from anything else, you're making a rod for your own back. And it's just such a simplistic, shallow answer. It doesn't do anything to acknowledge the complexities of the questions. The question, say what you like about someone like Rowan Williams, but at least he understood. People get frustrated with him, but he was, he's like the opposite end of the spectrum, isn't it? He was actually trying to grapple with the complexities of the problem, rather than just saying, oh, well, anyone who's concerned about themselves is selfish. I mean, it's like you say, Dan, you're quite right. If you stand up for your own individual rights, you're not just doing it necessarily for yourself, but you're doing it for everyone else's individual rights. And I don't even like that language of rights, really, because the whole language comes from, well, I think it's a kind of secularization of Christian language, which is about the dignity of the individual. And that is rooted in the fact that the individual is in some sense a participation in the image of God or in the nature of the divine or whatever it might be. So ultimately, the response, again, as Christians, we have the resources to speak to this in a profound way and to say, well, maybe, this question with vaccination, there is something more significant here, as an individual, or me as an individual, or you as an individual, there is actually something about you which is grounded and rooted in your divine origin, and you should be treated with dignity and respect. And maybe forced vaccinating you violates that dignity. And so how do we fit that with our desire, not my desire, but Welby's desire that everyone should be vaccinated? Let's have a proper conversation about this. Let's be adults about this. Yeah. And once again, it seems that we're incapable of that.
I think actually, you could easily take that speech and say, well, actually, the illusion is collectivism, not individualism. Yeah, and that the comments that he's made in the past, like no one is safe until everyone is safe, kind of thing, is in the same line to that illusion, really. And what's interesting is at the moment in General Synod, I'm picking up under the radar that there's been some tensions because there's been a number of people, small Orthodox Anglicans, and say, including some of the Save the Parish people who've come on board Synod and got voted on, and it's changed the mix somewhat and upset the apple cart. Yeah, and they've come like the Sons of Thunder with a certain enthusiasm and sense of urgency.
Yeah,
and some of the frustrations have been with message management, and being told, well, that's not the way that things have been done in the past. When really the Synod needs to wake up that actually there's very much a new constituency here who represent, much more ordinary people in the pews, and just defaulting to, oh, well, we don't do it that kind of way, it's not good enough. We can't be managing messages.
Yeah, I agree, and I support those Save the Parish people. I mean, I think we need to be careful not to make an idol out of the parish system, and to see it as a useful way of ministering to the culture and of reaching the culture. But basically, I think absolutely support it in the Church of England. We need to keep the parish. We need to major on the parish, because the parish is ultimately about being with the people and about actually reaching communities, being in this the trendy word, Daniel, incarnational. So we've got a great opportunity there. So I think we've probably wearied our listeners' ears by now. They probably need a rest and a nice cup of
batteries on their phone.
On their iPhone. Yeah. So you don't do that anymore. You just recharge things now, don't you? You used to have to buy batteries. Can you imagine? Anyway, Daniel, I think that's enough for today. As a deeply spiritual man, do you want to do a prayer for us, or a blessing or something to finish off?
The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you all. Amen.
Amen. I love that blessing. I often forget it when I'm trying to do it. So
I think of Christ in the eye of the storm on the boat with the disciples clinging on,
Yeah, lovely. That's a lovely image. Lovely image to leave people with. Well, listen, that was good. Now, next week, another big guest is coming on. I won't say who it is, but it is also big, different, but big. Yeah. And we're looking forward to that one as well. So do share this episode around with people you think might be interested. Get in touch with us at the email, reverendpod@gmail.com. We do have an admin who helps, but everything you write is treated sensitively, and I do at least read everything, and we reply to most stuff that comes in. And just engage, share the show. Please do subscribe, rate and review us. That's really helpful always. And Daniel, thank you so much. Looking forward to being with you again next time.
Okay, thank you, Jamie.